Good evening, and welcome to Skep Talk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Hello, I'm Dave Allman-Smith. I was going to say good evening, but it's not evening in Melbourne, Australia, where our speaker is currently. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker, Dr. John Cook. Dr. Cook leads his fight to educate the world about climate change from down under in Australia. 14 years ago, he founded the prize-winning website, Skeptical Science. Great website. I've used it a lot. You should find it, take a look at it if you haven't already. It's at skepticalscience.com. Dr. Cook co-authored 2 college textbooks on climate change, as well as writing the book Cranky Uncle versus Climate Change, which is available from all the usual sources. Among other honors, Dr. Cook received the Friend of the Planet Award from our local National Center on Science Education, where I used to work. Currently, he is a postdoctoral research fellow focusing on understanding and countering misinformation about climate change. And tonight, Dr. Cook joins us to share his insights with his presentation titled, What to Do About Misinformation in 4 Dimensions. Please type in any questions you have for Dr. Cook in the comments section over there. At the end, there will be time for me to read your questions aloud and for our speaker to answer. Without further ado, here's Dr. John Cook.
Okay, Dave, thanks very much. And thanks for inviting me to speak to the Bay Area Skeptics. I used to visit the Bay Area, or more generally San Francisco, every year back before there was a pandemic, and definitely hoping to be able to do that again sometime in the not too distant future. So what I'm talking about tonight or today or this morning, wherever you are, is how to counter misinformation. And I've got the subtitle in 4 dimensions because countering misinformation is complicated, and I'm going to talk about those 4 dimensions over the course of this presentation. And the reason why I'm talking about it in this way is because the problem of misinformation is complicated and it's interconnected. Misinformation penetrates through every part of society and through many different ways, through politics, through social media, through mainstream media, through person-to-person conversation. It has psychological influences, cultural, technological. There's just many different ways that misinformation affects society, and it's super complicated. And that means that if we want to come up with meaningful, effective solutions to misinformation, those solutions need to be holistic. They need to look at the overall picture, and they need to be interdisciplinary. We need to bring together all these different areas of research, psychology, critical thinking, technology, computer science. All these things need to come together if we want to really effectively deal with misinformation. So what I'm going to talk about specifically today is how I've tried to bring together different disciplines to tackle the problem of misinformation about climate change. And I've had a very intentionally narrow focus on climate misinformation over my career, working in this area for the last decade and a half. But the principles that I'm talking about apply to any topic where there is misinformation, which is basically every topic. So hopefully, while I'm giving you examples about the work I've done to counter climate misinformation, I hope that you all, no matter what area you're working in, can see something useful that you might be able to apply in whatever topic you're working in. Now, the framework that I've developed to help me make sense of all the different activities I do in fighting climate misinformation, I've ended up organizing it under these 4 Ds. And very briefly, the 4 Ds stand for detect, which involves identifying what are the key, most popular and most influential talking points or misinforming claims that need to be addressed. Deconstruct stands for or represents using critical thinking to identify how does misinformation mislead people. You need to do that. You need to identify the reasoning fallacies or the rhetorical techniques in misinformation in order to build debunking messages, fact checks, pre-bunking inoculation messages, whatever content you're trying to develop. And then you need to deploy that to the public. Find ways to get that in front of people in order to either inoculate people to stop misinformation from spreading, or try to correct misperceptions that people hold because they've been influenced by misinformation. So these 4 threads, detect, deconstruct, debunk, and deploy, I'm going to give you examples of how I've put these into practice in my work against misinformation about climate change. So let's look first at detect. For this, I've worked on a project we call CARDS. We actually spent probably way too much time trying to come up with an acronym. I'm big on acronyms and spend a lot of time thinking of them. But the acronym stands for Computer-Assisted Recognition of Denial and Skepticism. And the idea here was working with some political scientists from the UK, Travis Cohen, Miriam Nanko, and Konstantin Bousalis. We basically spent the last several years training a machine to automatically detect and categorize climate misinformation. And if that sounds difficult, it was. We basically slaved over this work for a number of years with a lot of help from the skeptical science team. And the way we did it was twofold. First, we had to build a taxonomy or a landscape of all the different types of misinformation claims that you might encounter about climate change. And so while this is a lot of information to take in, really the key thing I want to just mention here is that we documented 5 main categories of climate misinformation. The first 3 are science-based, arguing that either climate change is not happening, it's not caused by humans, or it's not bad. The 4th category was focused on climate solutions, arguing that climate solutions wouldn't work or wouldn't be effective in stopping climate change. And the 5th category were simply attacks on climate science. So they weren't making arguments about whether climate change was happening or not. They were just casting doubt on climate science or climate scientists in order to undermine public trust in climate science. Once we had built up our landscape or our taxonomy of misinforming claims, then we had to train a machine to be able to detect those claims. And the process there is relatively simple. It's just a matter of look at some text and match it to a specific claim in our taxonomy, but then repeat that tens of thousands of times, which took months of coding. But by the end, it was worth it because after coding, I think it was 80,000 paragraphs of climate misinformation, we were able to train a machine to accurately detect climate misinformation. And then we fed 20 years of articles about climate change into our machine, and it gave us this, a history, a 20-year history of misinformation about climate change. This particular graph was articles taken from websites by conservative think tanks, which were one of the most prolific sources of climate misinformation. And a couple of things jumped out at us, which took me by surprise. The first was that fifth category, attacks on climate science, was way, way bigger than the other three science categories. This surprised me because all of my effort up to that point had been focused on debunking science myths. And it turns out science myths were the smallest part of climate misinformation, and attacks on scientists, undermining the reliability of climate models and climate measurements, were a much bigger category of climate misinformation. And this is kind of a problem because there's very little research into how to counter attacks on science. And there's not that much effort being, there's not many practical efforts, like public engagement efforts, to push back against attacks on scientists either, despite the fact that this is one of the most common categories of climate misinformation. But the other obvious trend in this data is the fact that climate solutions are an ever-growing category or proportion of misinformation. Basically, climate deniers are making a strategic withdrawal from attacking or making science arguments and gradually shifting towards making more and more solutions arguments. All of climate misinformation has the same goal, whether they're arguing global warming is not happening, therefore we shouldn't act on climate change, or whether they're arguing solutions won't work, therefore we shouldn't act on climate change. Ultimately, they're just trying to delay climate action. But the science denial is becoming more and more untenable. And so we're seeing more and more solutions misinformation. And from a practical point of view, that means that what I take from this research is solutions misinformation is the future of climate denial, and we need to be making more and more efforts to counter that type of misinformation. And that's the benefit of the detect part of the 4D project. By understanding the landscape of misinformation, you can better identify what do we need to be responding to. If you're interested in checking out this research in more detail, it's actually going through the peer review process right now. But if you want to check out a prepress, you can just go to the URL at the top of this slide and read through how we actually trained our machine and the results from our analysis. So now that that research has been done, we're in the process currently of exploring how do we apply this. Now that we've trained a machine to automatically detect climate misinformation, what can you do with that? And we're doing a couple of things. The first thing we started doing was setting up a rapid response system where our machine is checking online misinformation in real time. And if it detects any new climate misinformation being published online, then it notifies any subscribers who want to be told that, hey, here's some new misinformation coming down the pipeline. as a way of developing some kind of rapid response system. We're in the process of putting that together right now. And another thing we're working on, which has only just started coming together over the last couple of weeks, is a browser plugin that, as you browse web pages about climate change, it detects if there's any misinformation on the web page. And we're working on having our browser plugin annotate web pages, like highlight sections that contain misinformation. So the idea there is that as people browse, it warns them if what they're looking at is misinformation. So that's a really exciting project. I'm not sure how long that's going to take, though. It's getting it working in practice is the real challenge. So that's the detect theme in the 4D project. Once you've identified what is the misinformation that I need to be focusing on and responding to, the next step is rigorously working out, is this actually misinformation? And if it is, how does it mislead people? And that's really a critical thinking question. And to come up with a way to do that in a systematic way, I teamed up with two critical thinking philosophers from the University of Queensland, Peter Elton and David Kincaid. And we wrote a paper. Again, it was published in 2018, so you can go read it now. And the URL at the top will take you straight to the paper. And we wrote a paper where we developed a systematic methodology for deconstructing and analyzing misinformation. I mentioned at the beginning how we need interdisciplinary solutions to complicated problems like misinformation. This was one of my hardest interdisciplinary collaborations, working with philosophers. I'm a quantitative scientist. I'm used to dealing with statistics and numbers and analyzing experimental data. Philosophers have a completely different, not just a different vocabulary, but a different way of thinking about the world. And it took us a while in this collaboration before we kind of were able to get on the same page, just not only vocabulary, but how we were thinking about the problem and how to, what were our goals in this research. What we ended up coming up with was a step-by-step flowchart for deconstructing and analyzing misinformation. If you want to get a very short 3-minute video introduction to the research, I recommend you go to sks.to/cafe. We put together a critical thinking cafe video that introduces the research in hopefully an entertaining and funny way. And this is a simplified version of the flowchart. There's really 3 steps to deconstructing misinformation. I'll explain it now, and then I'll give you a concrete example to make it a bit clearer. Step 1 is deconstructing a claim into an argument structure. Every argument has the following structure: a series of starting assumptions or premises and a conclusion. So every argument is premise 1, premise 2. There can be 1 or more premises. Therefore, conclusion. So you want to, in this step 1, take any claim that you're analyzing and deconstruct it into this premise, conclusion structure. Once you've finished that step, then you go to step 2, check whether the argument is logically valid. If you assume that all the premises are true, does it logically follow that the conclusion must be true as well? If the answer is no, if it's not logically valid, usually the reason why is because the argument has a hidden premise or an unstated assumption. And it's really important that you identify that hidden premise and add it to your argument to make it logically valid. Now, it's a bit hard to kind of visualize what I mean in the abstract. But practically speaking, well, I found that this is usually the most important part of deconstructing an argument, because misinformation often contains unstated assumptions, and those are usually where an argument goes wrong or where it misleads. Once you've made your argument valid, then you can go to the third and final step. Check the premises and see whether all of them are true. And this is the final step where you find out where the misinformation goes wrong. And you can more surgically pinpoint exactly where it goes wrong and how it goes wrong. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. Here is one of the most common arguments or myths about climate change. And the argument is that the reason why climate is changing now is because climate has always changed in the Earth's past. Now, how do we deconstruct this argument and analyze it? The first step is to take this claim and deconstruct it into a series of premises leading to a conclusion. This argument is basically has two premises. The first premise, climate has changed naturally in the past before humans were around. The second premise is that climate is currently changing. And then the conclusion is that current climate change must be natural. So that's step one. We've deconstructed the argument. Step two, is this argument logically valid? If we assume that premise one and premise two are both true, does it logically follow that the conclusion must be true as well? And the answer to this question is no, it's not. It's not a logically valid argument. Just because climate has naturally changed in the past doesn't mean that it has to be naturally caused now. It is not. It's not a logical conclusion. And so, because the argument is logically invalid, we have to identify what is that unstated assumption. What is the third hidden premise that would make this a logically valid argument? And I'll just jump to the punchline. The third premise is the assumption that past drivers of climate change must be the same as current drivers of climate change. Whatever drove climate back before humans around, whatever natural factor, must also be driving climate change now while we're here. And now that we have a logically valid argument, we can go straight to the third step and look at all the premises. I've kind of given away the answer here, but the first premise is true. Climate has changed naturally in the past. The second premise is true. Climate is changing now. But the third premise commits single cause fallacy. It assumes that there's only one factor that drives climate change, natural causes, when in reality, there are other factors that can drive climate change, such as human activity. So going through this process helps us identify what is the fallacy that a misinforming claim commits. In this case, the fallacy is single cause. We took this step-by-step methodology and applied it to around 50 of the most common myths about climate change and identified all the different reasoning fallacies or rhetorical techniques in all of these different climate myths. From a communication point of view, this was really an important resource. Knowing what all the fallacies are in each climate myth is what you need if you want to show how myths are wrong and inoculate the public against misinformation. Now, one challenge though is in order to identify reasoning fallacies in misinformation, you need to understand or be aware of what all the different possible reasoning fallacies are. So over the last decade or so, I've also been developing a taxonomy of fallacies, rhetorical techniques, and traits of conspiratorial thinking that you find in misinformation. And it's a just like that other taxonomy I showed you, it's a growing, expanding taxonomy. It's a lot of information, and even communicating and educating people on that is a challenge, which I'll come back to later on how to address that challenge. Okay, so we're at the halfway mark. Our third theme in the 4D project is debunking. Once you've identified the reasoning fallacies or the rhetorical techniques in misinformation, then you can write debunkings or fact checks or pre-bunkings in order to counter the misinformation. Now, over the course of my research career, I've published a lot of studies and run a lot of experiments testing different ways of debunking. I just want to highlight two of the most significant. In 2017, I published a paper in PLOS ONE that explored how to inoculate people against misinformation. And the research involved showing people some misinformation about climate change. And this was the misinformation we used. It was taken verbatim from a website called the Global Warming Petition Project. And the website argues that over 31,000 Americans with a science degree have signed a statement saying that humans aren't disrupting climate. Therefore, there's no scientific consensus on climate change. What I found was when people were shown this misinformation, it had a negative effect. Misinformation does work. And the negative effect worked differently across the population. In this graph, the horizontal axis is political ideology. People to the right are more right-wing, people to the left are more left-wing. So what I found were people who were more politically conservative were more influenced by misinformation about climate change. This means that misinformation has a polarizing effect on the public. As misinformation washes over society, it pulls people apart and you end up with a more polarized society. This is one of the dangerous elements of misinformation. In my experiment, to a different group of participants, I showed them this inoculating message before showing them the misinformation. And the interesting thing about this inoculation was it didn't mention the Global Warming Petition Project at all. Instead, I focused on the general technique of fake experts, or in other words, argument from false authority, which is a way to cast doubt on scientific consensus by using people who convey the impression of expertise but don't have the relevant expertise. And the Global Warming Petition Project uses this technique in spades, in bulk, really, because amongst those 31,000 signatories, less than 0.1% of them have any actual climate expertise. So it's anyone with a science degree, computer scientists, mechanical engineers, veterinary scientists, medical scientists, but almost no climate scientists. What I found was when I inoculated people before showing them the misinformation was mostly, or across the board, it was neutralized. There's a slight slope to this blue line representing the inoculated group, but statistically it's equivalent to a horizontal line. The misinformation was neutralized across the political spectrum. So this tells us a couple of things. Firstly, if people have an aversion to being misled, which is bipartisan, whether you're conservative or liberal, nobody likes being tricked. So explaining the tricks used to mislead people neutralizes those tricks. It's like exposing the sleight of hand in a magician's trick. Secondly, you can inoculate people against misinformation without even mentioning it by just explaining the rhetorical techniques used to mislead. we call this logic-based inoculation. And it's another word for critical thinking. By increasing people's critical thinking and their ability to spot misleading rhetorical techniques, that builds up their immunity to misinformation. One more debunking experiment I wanted to just run through quickly was after my initial research into identifying logic-based inoculation as a powerful way to counter misinformation, the next step was, how do you put that into practice? What are effective ways to inoculate people against the rhetorical techniques and fallacies in misinformation? And so I ran an experiment with some of my colleagues, Sojun Kim at George Mason University and Emily Braga at the University of Minnesota. And we basically, well, we did this across several topics: vaccination, climate change, and gun control. And what we found was using a critical thinking approach, very similar to the one I just outlined in the detect section. This was effective in debunking misinformation about vaccination, which is a very relevant topic in 2021. But we also tried another approach using humor to counter misinformation. And basically the humorous approach involved taking the flaw in the original misinformation, the logical flaw, and transplanting it into a parallel situation or an analogous situation. And using that approach of parallel argumentation perfectly lends itself to humorous cartoons. What we found was either the serious critical thinking approach or the humorous cartoon approach were both equally effective. But using eye tracking data and mediation analysis, we found that they were different for different reasons. The critical thinking approach was perceived as more credible, and that's what led to reducing the credibility of the misinformation, in other words, debunking the misinformation. But the humorous approach was, it attracted more attention. People looked at it longer. And it was this greater attention, which is what was the mechanism that reduced people's belief in the misinformation. So what we took from this research was there is no single magic bullet or one way to counter misinformation. There's multiple approaches, and they can be effective through multiple different pathways. But the other thing we found in this research and others was there were other benefits of the humor-based approach. We found that humorous debunkings were more likely to be shared. They provoked more information seeking. They wanted people to they made people more likely to want to seek out more information about the topic. And so we were super interested in this humor-based approach because of these other benefits. And so that leads me to the fourth thread in the 4D project. Once you've detected your misinformation, you've deconstructed it, and you've developed your debunking content, how do you get it out in front of people? And the answer is in as many ways as possible. And in my work countering climate misinformation, I've used a lot of different avenues to get my debunking content out in front of as many eyeballs as possible. We started with the Skeptical Science website, which I founded in 2007, and just worked at making that basically what you find in search results when you Google a climate myth. And to a large part, we've been pretty successful in that. When our traffic, the vast bulk of it comes from Google searches. So it is people searching, is global warming caused by the sun? Are human activities affecting climate change? those kind of Google searches usually end up, or we get a lot of traffic from people making those kind of searches. In 2015, we launched a massive open online course done at the University of Queensland with the Skeptical Science team. And what we did in this course was debunk around 50 of the most common myths about climate change using videos, interviewing experts, lots of online interactive quizzes and activities in the edX platform. And this MOOC, Massive Open Online Course, has had around over 40,000 students from over 180 countries enroll in it over the last 5 years. So it's reached a lot of people, and it's also been used by a lot of educators as well. We've made it available as an educational resource. Last year, I published a book taking this humor-based, logic-based inoculation and compiling all the cartoons and content into a book. And you can check that out at crankyuncle.com. And over the last 6 months, I've been working with Facebook, who around a year ago, they started the Climate Science Information Centre. And then I think it was either late last year or early this year. I think it was late last year. It was in February. They launched a fact-checking section where they debunk myths about climate change. And they did it in collaboration with myself and two other researchers, Sander van der Linden and Anthony Leisowitz, who are both experts in either climate communication or debunking misinformation. And so every fact check on the Facebook platform that in this section sticks to the best practices for debunking misinformation. And one of the important things that I was keen to get in there was explaining the rhetorical techniques or fallacies in the misinformation. Understanding how misinformation misleads is a key part of debunking it. And lastly, one more thing I wanted to talk about. Communicating the techniques of misinformation is a big education challenge, because it's not enough to, firstly, you have to make people aware of all these different techniques. And that's hard enough as it is, because there are so many of them. But then you want people to also internalize them deeply enough that they can spot them in the wild. And that requires an extra deeper level of engagement with the content. How do you do that? To try to solve that mystery, over the last year, we've been working on a critical thinking game called Cranky Uncle, which uses gamification, cartoons, and humor combined with critical thinking and psychology to inoculate players against the techniques of science denial. So the game works from that Flick taxonomy, the techniques of science denial, and it explains each of the techniques of misinformation to anyone playing the game. So as they go through the game, Cranky Uncle is a cartoon character who mentors you into how to become a cranky uncle yourself, a science-denying cranky uncle. And so he explains, here's how I deny science. Here's how I use the anecdote fallacy. And then it uses those cartoon analogies as ways of demonstrating different logical fallacies. And once you've learnt the definitions of each of these fallacies, then you practice critical thinking by being shown misinformation and trying to spot what is the denial technique in this myth. And the idea of, or the power of games, is you can use all the gameplay elements, collecting cranky points, leveling up so that each time you level up, your mood gets a little bit crankier. Use those gameplay elements to motivate people to get further and further into the game, because the more they play the game, the more they practice critical thinking, and the more it becomes easier and quicker for them to spot misinformation techniques. since we launched the game in last December, we've been promoting it to teachers, and we've been seeing teachers start using the game in their classes across, not just across the US, but in countries around the world. It's only available in English, although it's just been translated into Dutch right now, and we're in the process of getting a multi-language version of the game out. What's really encouraged me is that the game has been adopted in classes in both red states and blue states, conservative parts of the country and liberal parts of the country, and reaching communities that I probably wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. And this is the power, I think, of using games and games that can be used in the classroom. It enables a scientist like me to reach audiences that I wouldn't otherwise be able to reach. The other thing that surprised me is teachers have been using this game in all manner of classrooms and subjects, not just what I thought it would be, like climate science, environmental science, but also maths, biology, chemistry, physics, and even non-scientific, like non-science subjects like English and philosophy. So basically, a game that teaches critical thinking is relevant to any subject that contains misinformation, which it turns out to be all subjects. So that's really it. I hope I haven't gone too long, but I just wanted to finish by saying that that this approach, this holistic and interdisciplinary approach to countering misinformation, I've developed this framework in response to climate misinformation, but now I'm just starting to explore using it in other contexts and in other areas, because that same approach can be just as effective in misinformation in other areas like COVID-19 or vaccination or evolution and everything else. So I hope you all find that interesting. You can, if you want to find out more, you can check out my work either on crankyuncle.com or on my YouTube channel, on Twitter, although I haven't been active on Twitter that much lately because work has been so busy, and happy to answer any questions if you want to follow up by email. So I might stop there, and happy to answer any questions if we have time.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cook. It's very impressive what you've taken on here. A bit daunting, I would say. Let me tell you a little bit about what I did when I first started volunteering for the National Center for Science Education. I spent about 4 hours a day looking over news outlets, identifying misinformation about the science of evolution. And after a few weeks of that, it was daunting. It was depressing. It reminds me of the suicidally depressed robot in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So to have an AI do this, to have computers do this, I'll let them take on that task. Much more healthy for me. Let's see, and then the whole process of doing that, we were not looking at social media, and I see now that you're hoping to take on that as well through this process. Very impressive. Let's see. How about questions? What questions have we? Aha! Here we have one. One moment. Okay, how can you use logic to fight people who use faith or gut feelings to believe what they want to believe?
That's a really tough question. And sometimes this is not the most encouraging answer, but sometimes it is nigh impossible to do that. But I will say that the logic-based approach can potentially help you sidestep ideologically driven science denial. And so I kind of hinted at that in my one of those experiments I showed, climate misinformation or climate denial is driven by ideology. So that really is a kind of a faith or a gut feel approach to rejecting scientific evidence. And researchers have found that if you try to tackle climate denial head on with climate messages, it can often be ineffective because people have their barriers up against climate misinformation. It's like a trigger. But you can go around it by talking about the same techniques that are used to mislead, but in a different context, like tobacco misinformation, that's not as polarized. It doesn't have those triggers. And it helps people internalize the different ways that they can be misled by misinformation. And what my research found was then when they see that misinformation, even in climate change, where they are inherently biased, that misinformation no longer influences them. So that doesn't fix the problem entirely, but it's one step towards countering polarizing misinformation. So misinformation polarizes the public. We at least neutralize that influence. The more broader answer to the question, though, is when you're dealing with a subject where there is faith or ideology involved, usually the most productive approach is, firstly, the messenger counts. It needs to be a messenger who shares the values of the audience that they're trying to reach. And it needs to be a message that doesn't threaten their ideology or their beliefs. So if you can ideally communicate the science in a way that at the very least doesn't threaten their ideology, but or potentially even affirms it, then that's the most effective way to communicate science in that context.
Good. Yeah, very good answer on that. I appreciate that. I have people who are very strong. I have friends who are very strong religious sorts who, all of their decisions about anything, religion comes first, science is, anyway, so I'm getting better at dealing with them. Oh, something for all of you. If you missed last month's Skep Talk, put it this way, if you watched last month's Skep Talk with Mark Bosloff, you have seen the icons for the fallacies that Dr. Cook has been showing us tonight. It's very, I like that approach. It makes it a lot easier. It makes it easier for teaching. Okay, we have another question here. Vic Spain. In the petition example, did the writers intentionally misrepresent scientific credentials? Do they study methods for getting traction on misinformation, to using science to counter science?
Yeah, so there's two questions there, and they're both really interesting ones. The first part, did they intentionally misrepresent scientific credentials? Sometimes the hardest misinformation is the one that doesn't outright state a falsehood, but it frames the information or presents it in a way that either gives a misleading impression or can guide people towards the wrong conclusion. In the case of the petition project, they were quite upfront about what were the credentials of all the 31,000 signatories, and they list them all, and that's how I was able to show that hardly any of them had climate degrees. And so there is a web page where it shows, here are all our veterinary scientists, here are all our engineers, here are all our computer scientists, here are all the different disciplines. So if you are willing to look deeply, you can find it. The challenge is that generally people tend to process information in a fairly shallow way, and all they usually will take in is 31,000 scientists, and scientists equals experts, and they don't dig down to find out, well, are they scientists with the relevant expertise? And so you often see when 31,000 scientists then gets translated by a climate denier talking about this in an interview, on the TV, in a talk. They'll often say, 31,000 of the world's leading climate scientists say. And so it kind of morphs, and that's when it is overtly misrepresenting the credentials. But in the original content, if you read the fine print, you'll see all the different disciplines they come from. But the intent is to just 31,000 scientists, and people tend to come to a conclusion from that. The second question, do they study methods for getting traction on misinformation? I think that's a really important question, because the answer is yes. There's a famous memo published in 2002 by a Republican pollster, Frank Luntz. He did his own market research and found that if you confuse the public about the scientific consensus on climate change, you win the debate on climate policy. You don't have to win the policy debate. Just get people confused over whether the experts agree, and then there's no need for climate action, and therefore you've won the policy debate. And so he was doing market research on how to effectively misinform the public in order to win whatever political fight they were trying to win at the time. And then they put that into practice, and they've been putting it into practice ever since. So I think that's an important thing for any of us involved in science, science communication, critical thinking, to recognize while we're doing events like this webinar, trying to foster critical thinking and trying to build people's science literacy, there are other groups who are having their own meetings where they're trying to come up with strategies to misinform the public and win their policy agendas. And if promoting climate misinformation achieves that, then they'll do that. So I think we need to go into these kind of issues with our eyes wide open.
Yeah, there can be financial incentives for spreading misinformation. Here's something. Could you comment on, you've been talking, circle around it a bit, but what is referred to as lateral reading. Are you familiar with that?
Lateral reading. So lateral I think lateral reading usually refers to like exploring the sources of the information.
Exactly.
Yeah. So critical thinking is a broad umbrella. So when I say critical thinking, I'm being a little bit cheeky, because I'm really applying that term to a very specific aspect of critical thinking, which is logic-based reasoning. But another really important aspect of critical thinking is media literacy, or being able to assess the credibility of information sources. And while my critical thinking game is about this logic-based reasoning or spotting logical fallacies or rhetorical techniques, there are some other really powerful and effective games that boost people's media literacy. Bad News was one of the original games. I think it's getbadnews.com. Harmony Square is based on the same model, and it addresses misinformation about that's designed to undermine democracy. And then the same creators also developed Go Viral. All of these games are about helping people to assess information sources and distinguish between misleading information sources and more reputable sources. And that skill of media literacy is also crucially important, and separate to, but complementary to, the logic-based approach in my work.
Great, thank you. Have we other questions here, or are we running out of time? Here's one from Jay Diamond. You mentioned Google as a resource for many people doing their own research. In your experience, what role does Wikipedia play in forming decisions? That's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, Wikipedia is kind of a two-edged sword. Like on the one hand, It's very handy information, and they are trying to put up standards like being, like any statements on there that aren't resourced tend to get taken down by the editors. On the other hand, being a crowdsourced platform means that misinformation can get in there. So in my experience, I do occasionally rely on Wikipedia with a big grain of salt. I might look to it for getting some information, but then ultimately, if it's something that I need to know with confidence, I'll go to more authoritative institutions who vet their information much more rigorously. So yeah, I think grain of salt is probably how I would characterize Wikipedia.
Okay, question from Howard Winnett. I don't know how to pronounce it actually, but how do we distinguish between a mathematical approximation used in modeling and a fake premise in the way the layperson can understand it? Whew, that's deep.
It is deep. You've touched on a sore point, Howard, because the 2018 critical thinking paper that I talked about in my Deconstruct phase, we intentionally restricted our scope of that work to deductive misinformation, which is misinformation with declarative like claims. So it's claims like global warming is caused by the sun, or climate change is not happening, like definitive statements. And they're easier to debunk, so we kind of hit those first as kind of a low-hanging fruit. The other type of misinformation is inductive misinformation, and those are probabilistic statements. Like, we don't really know how much humans have contributed to global warming, or climate models are uncertain, therefore we can't trust them, or COVID epidemiological models are uncertain, therefore we can't rely on them for making decisions about shutting down an economy. Those type of arguments are a different beast, and they require a different approach. And we have been working on research to come up with a similar rigorous way of assessing them and dealing with them, but we haven't finished that work yet. So I wish I could give you a black and white answer right now. All I can say is we're still working on it. I probably won't go beyond that, just because it's
reminds me of a fellow that approached me, and he came up with something that was clearly a false premise, and I pointed out that, well, that's contrary to scientific consensus. And he said, well, scientific consensus used to be that phlogiston and dephlogiston handled combustion. Okay. Yeah, easy to we stopped that. Okay. Jay Diamond has another one. How would you recommend dealing with I'll try that again. Well, maybe a little more beer to help here. Anti-intellectualism, bias against experts, doing my own research, which was exactly the example that I just gave. He'd done his own research and found that scientists were wrong.
Yeah, I think that's an increasing proportion of misinformation, or it's a bigger part of misinformation than I think people have realized. And consequently, there isn't that much work done in how to respond to it. So I've started to look into this myself and kind of coming up against a dearth of research on effective responses to anti-expertise, anti-intellectualism. What we have done is looked at ad hominem attacks against climate scientists. We've seen a lot of different types of attacks as ways of undermining public trust in scientists. And so I can give you a kind of a hand wavy answer, which is this is not a rigorous answer, but this is kind of just to be a little bit unscientific, this is kind of my gut answer. And that is, explain how science works to people, explain the scientific method. And this kind of answers that previous question about more inductive type of misinformation as well. How do we have confidence that our scientific understanding is robust and true? And we do have that confidence when we systematically go through the scientific method. Step one, rely on evidence. Step two, use rigorous statistical analysis. Next, we get other experts to peer review our work. So you're putting your analysis and results through kind of the most rigorous type of spam filter there is, which is the peer review process. And then the last stage is once peer review research is published, and that doesn't guarantee that it's perfect, but then what happens is other scientists will try to replicate your results. And if you find results getting replicated by different scientists using different methods, that's when we start having more confidence that our scientific understanding is true. And so that's the most reliable way of knowing the scientific method. And I think increasing people's understanding that science isn't just a body of facts that came into being, or science isn't a destination, it's a process. I think if people understood that better, it would, well, my hope, my gut instinct is that would help against anti-intellectual arguments.
Great. I want the audience to know that this presentation will be up on the Bay Area Skeptics YouTube channel pretty much forever. And with that, we'll put up various of the links that you provided us during your talk. I believe it's time to bring tonight's program to a close. Thank you again, Dr. Cook, for acquainting us with your amazing novel work. And thank you, dear audience, for joining us and for your questions. The next Skept Talk will feature another Aussie, Richard Saunders, on September 9th, when he brings us up to date on the Great Australian Psychic Prediction Project. In the meantime, stay well, expand your circle of empathy, and join us on Patreon. Good night, not good night, because it's not night in Melbourne. Goodbye for now.